right, let me introduce myself. My name is Sarah Hope. I'm the Drug and Alcohol Program Manager with Vertical Identity. We are a third-party administrator of consortium and fleet management services for the FMCSA, motor carriers and fleets nationwide. Here's a little bit about who we are, what we do, and who we serve. We are a one-stop shop and experience vendor. We're located out of Arizona. We have three main areas that we assist our clients with. We do background checks, so criminal background checks, the driving records and the PSP files, and the drug and alcohol past employer violation checks. Right now, they have to be done manually as well as electronically. Starting in January, you will have to do them both a paper request and an electronic request, and we will be going over that. And if you're a client of ours, we do manage that for you. And then we also do drug testing administration. So we own and operate 2 drug testing clinics in the Phoenix, Arizona area under the name of 911 Drug Testing, as well as manage networks for LabCorp, Quest, and the Alere eScreen network in all 50 states. So the Alere eScreen network has 5,100 locations. What we love about them most is that everything is electronic. There's no paper CCFs. We can even text you the drug testing request passport right to your driver's cell phones. And then we help you administer and set up an in-house on-site program for DOT if that's something that you were interested in. In our experience, there's a lot of counties and municipalities that are moving into that space, and a lot of times they want help from an experienced company to be able to walk them through that program. The last piece of it is we have a large fleet of owner-operators. As an owner-operator, when you're just a one-man show that owns your truck and you're driving, you are required to be part of a random pool. That's what a consortium is. And with the FMCSA, it is required that an owner-operator be part of a random drug and alcohol testing pool. So we do have thousands of motor carriers that are owner-operators nationwide that we do manage their random pool. And then we are completely online. And so you get a portal. We do the background checks, the MVRs, the drug testing, everything from A to Z, which makes us basically a one-stop shop. All right. So let's go over a little bit of the agenda today, what we're going to cover. We have an hour. We'll probably get done in about 45 minutes. We're going to be leaving the last 15 minutes for questions and answers. So the first part is, what is the clearinghouse and what information will it contain and how is it going to improve highway safety? The second is the timeline. Where did this clearinghouse come from? Right? We're all hearing about it and we're not really sure where it came from. And now we're up to a deadline, which is January, and we all have to act. So what are the milestones that we've had leading up to and beyond implementation of the clearinghouse? And then the third thing we're going to cover is, how are we going to use the clearinghouse? What are the required actions users have to take, both motor carriers and owners, drivers, and owner-operators, as well as substance abuse professionals and MROs. Everybody has a different role. We're going to be talking about what are the required actions as those users must take once the clearinghouse is operational in January. And then fourth, how are we going to register for the clearinghouse? Registration is now open as of about a few weeks ago. And if you are a client of ours, I do have some of our clients on the call. Whenever you do register, you will need to select Vertical Identity as your third-party administrator so that we can perform all of these services on your behalf and do the reporting. And then at the end, I'll give you more information, additional resources, as well as points of contacts. All right. So what is the clearinghouse? The clearinghouse is basically a database that is being maintained by the FMCSA that is going to track violations. Now, the current process of the FMCSA and for reporting violations, which are drug and alcohol violations, is there is no reporting for consortium, third-party administrators, MROs, or substance abuse professionals. The current process relies on drivers to inform a new employer of any violations of the drug and alcohol rules committed while on with a previous employer. And then motor carriers are required to monitor drivers' compliance with DOT drug and alcohol regulations. And I'm going to break these three down a little bit. So running our collection sites here in Arizona, there is a certain amount of collections that we do at the collection sites that we will have a DOT regulated driver that is usually an owner operator or trying to get leased onto another company that will come into the collection site, and they want to pay for their own DOT drug test. Okay. So they come in and they go ahead and provide a sample. If the sample is adulterated in any way, shape, or form, in other words, if it doesn't look like urine, smell like urine, if it's the wrong temperature, the second part of that is that there must be an observed collection. There is a very high possibility, upwards of 60%, that at that point, the donor is unable to provide a good sample. And so they know that we have caught the fact that they're trying to adulterate that sample. And if it goes to the lab, they will get a failed drug test. So what happens is what's called a refusal to test. So what they do is the donor decides, oh, yep, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do the second part of the collection, and I'm going to leave. So that's called a refusal to test. The collection site reports it as a refusal to test in the system. However, for a consortium third-party administrator, the collection site, the MRO, or the substance abuse professional, actually, the substance abuse professional doesn't come in at this point, but the MRO and the collection site, even the motor carrier right now has no way to report that. What that means is that if you're a motor carrier and you're trying to hire that driver, let's say that they were on some sort of illegal substance and they're just checking to see, if that was still coming up. They're not going to tell you that they went in and there was a refusal to test. There is no reporting for that. So there has been a huge loophole in the system for many years that there is no process for a collection site, a motor carrier, or a medical review officer to actually immediately report a violation. So what ends up happening is that a lot of these drivers, even though they've had a violation, there's no way as a new motor carrier when you're hiring someone for you to know that happened. They're not going to include them. And if they were applying for someone else, they don't have to include them in the application. So therefore, when you request for the past employer violations, there is no reporting because it's like it didn't exist. So the current process is it relies on drivers to inform the employer. Well, that's not also happening, right? And then the motor carriers are required to monitor the driver's compliance, but you're unable to do that in an effective way because of this huge loophole that has existed. So what is the FMCSA Commercials Driver's License Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, and what will the database contain? So the database is going to contain CDL drivers drug and alcohol program violation information. It is going to be reported by employers and medical review officers, so positive tests and refusals. A reason that an employer would need to report a violation would be if you send them for a random drug test and they absolutely refuse and they're like, never mind, I quit. So you would have to, as a motor carrier or an employer, you would be responsible for reporting that to the clearinghouse, and that would appear as a violation. The medical review officer, in the case of the collection site, once that test comes over as a refusal to test, would also report that into the clearinghouse. And then also it's going to include information whether a driver has successfully completed the mandatory return to duty process following a violation. So after a driver has a violation, they must go through certain steps with a substance abuse professional. And once those steps have been completed, then they have to do a return to duty process. And we're going to be going over that a little bit more in the next few slides. Now, the clearinghouse is going to keep driver information secure. So this is not a place of free for all for you to be able to get information about any driver without their authorization. Only authorized users, including employers and the FMCSA, are going to be able to register and access the clearinghouse for designated purposes only. Other enforcement agencies, such as the state law enforcement agencies, will only be able to receive driver eligibility status, and then drivers can access their own information, but not information of other drivers. So let me go over this a little bit deeper into this section here. So authorized users. This is where the registration comes in. This is where employers need to register to be able to access the clearinghouse and to be able to get information on a specific driver. That driver will be required to give consent before the motor carrier is going to be able to pull the information. We're also going to be going over that a little bit deeper here in the next few slides. Now, as far as point 2, with other enforcement agencies, such as the state law enforcement agencies, will only receive driver eligibility status. This has been modified a little bit to where it's going to be rolled out over the next 3 years to the SDLAs. And the reason is because right now, in order for a driver to get their CDL, then they have to check with the state law enforcement agencies that they qualify. However, once a clearinghouse is up and running and a violation occurs, they will not be able to get or renew their CDL if there's a pending violation. However, there's a gap between when the states are implementing that and the FMC, them being able to check the FMCSA for violations. So there's a 3-year a timeline that the FMCSA gave the state law enforcement agencies to be able to comply with that regulation. Okay, so how is the clearinghouse going to increase safety in our nation's roadways? So we will have real-time access to reported violation information for the authorized users. We're going to have easier access for employers to meet the pre-employment investigation and reporting obligations. It's going to make it more difficult for the drivers to conceal drug and alcohol violations from employers, just like I mentioned before. It happens all the time, unfortunately. And it's also going to give more insight into the employer compliance with drug and alcohol testing rules. All of those things will lead to safer roadways and a safer fleet, right? Which will end up in turn saving you on insurance costs and all sorts of possible legal issues that you may have. So because the violations are going to be reported real time, there is going to be, no more of a loophole for the drivers that decide to be non-compliant to be able to use that loophole. And then as an employer or a motor carrier that you're hiring drivers, you're going to have instant access once the driver gives you permission to pull, whether or not they have met all of the drug and alcohol testing requirements for the last 3 years. All right, let's talk a little bit about the timeline. So where did this drug and alcohol clearinghouse come from? So it was December 5th, 2016 that the final rule was published. There was the requirements issued by the FMCSA and the user roles established. And then in March of 2019, there was an information phase where they released information about the launch of the clearinghouse website, what it looked like. And there was a lot of frequently asked questions at that point as they prepared for the registration opening in the fall of 2019. In March, you were also able to subscribe for email updates so that you were able to keep informed as to what the changes were. And for example, one of the changes is what the pricing is, because there is a cost to be able to pull the records. It's a minimal cost, but there is a cost that the motor carrier is going to have to pay to access the database. So in fall of 2019, the registration opened, and at that time, you could create your user account ahead of the implementation date, which is officially January 6, 2020. So on January 6, 2020, mandatory reporting begins. What does that mean? That means that anyone that has a violation that they must report into the clearinghouse must be ready to report that change or that violation. So, as a motor carrier, as I mentioned, if you have a refusal to test, someone that said, nope, I'm not going to go for that random, you are required as a motor carrier to log into the clearinghouse and to report that information. If you are a client of ours, then we will represent you and report that information into the clearinghouse for you if that is something that you want us to handle for you. And then January 6th, both electronic and manual queries are required. So what that means is starting on January 6th, because the floodgates open and real-time violations can start coming in. Whenever you're onboarding a new CDL driver, not only will you have to send a manual query, so the regular pre-employment query that you sent to past employers, asking whether they had any drug and alcohol violations. You still have to get assigned consent from the CDL driver to do that. Now, with the electronic queries that you're going to be doing, instead of the signed consent, that driver is going to have to be registered in the clearinghouse so that they can give you electronic consent. We're also going to be going over that. For the owner operators that I do have on the call, you not only have to register as a motor carrier, you also have to register as an as a driver. So as an owner operator, you have to register under your DOT as a motor carrier and then also as a driver. And then January 6, 2023, it's 3-year post-implementation. So by that time, you're going to have 3 years of violation in the system, so you will no longer have to request manual queries, only electronic queries moving forward. All right, using the clearinghouse. Who's going to be required to use the clearinghouse? Drivers who hold commercial driver's licenses or commercial learner's permits will be required to use the clearinghouse. The main purpose is to give permission to access their records. Employers of CDL drivers who operate commercial motor vehicles, because you have to report any violations. Third-party administrators such as us. If you have a consortium or a third-party administrator that you work with, they will also need to be in the system, because as a motor carrier, you will need to go in and select them for them to be able to check on violations for new hires for you. So for example, when we do, and onboard a new CDL driver for motor carriers, one of the first things that we do is run a background check to check for any type of criminal history that the company may not have a safety tolerance for. Check to see their motor vehicle record from the state that they hold their CDL to see if they can drive and what their violations are. And then when we send out the information for the manual check, at that time, starting in January, we will also have to check for the violations electronically. Well, as a third-party administrator, unless you have selected the company that manages that program for you, they will not be able to do any of the reporting for you as your agent. So it's really important that if your third-party administrator has not reached out to you about registering, then there is a possibility that they may not be registered themselves. And I know that there's a lot of smaller companies that may not be familiar with the changes coming in the clearinghouse. So I would suggest that you do give them a call and find out if they have registered, and so that you are able to select them as your third party administrator. And then medical review officers. So medical review officers, for those of you that you are not aware of what they do, is when a sample is collected, so you have a urine sample that's collected at the collection site, then it goes to the lab. The lab checks it for the drugs that are regulated under the FMCSA. If there is anything going on with that collection or that urine, let's say that they're they have opioids in their system. So if they have a legal prescription for those opioids, and so it comes out, it's not a positive yet. It's what we call in this industry a non-negative. If it's a non-negative, then it has to go to the medical review officer. At that point, the medical review officer will do an interview with the donor to find out whether they have a legal prescription for the opioid. So what happens is that if they are abusing opioids at all, the medical review officer will have a conversation and say, hey, do you have a prescription for this? If you do, can you send it to me? So the donor sends it to the medical review officer. So let's say they're on 10 milligrams, but they go into, they send it to the lab and they actually have 50 milligrams in their system. Well, then they're abusing opioids. So at that point, the medical review officer will come back and state that it is positive, even though they had a prescription, they're taking more than they're supposed to. So there is that, and the medical review officer is always independent from the lab. So they're an independent third party. And that conversation between the medical review officer and the donor is never reported back to the motor carrier unless there's a positive. Many times that conversation is had, and sometimes a lot of you are like, why did this drug test take 7 days? Well, because you don't know what's going on and the other side, if it needed further testing and it needed to go over to the medical review officer, the medical review officer has, contacts the donor has 5 days to get back to them. And then they clear it or they don't clear it, and that's when you get a result. And then, so the medical review officer, if there is a violation, they are required to use the clearinghouse and report that out. Substance abuse professionals also are required. So after that, after we get a positive for a DOT regulated FMCSA result, then there's a certain process that driver has to go to. And there is the next step in order for them to continue to drive is that they must go see and visit with and sit with and have counseling with a substance abuse professional who then makes a determination on how they can get back on the road. And so it's much like a counseling session. Many times they have to go and, go to AA meetings and, have a conversation with them about all sorts of things. And every single one is different. For every single one of our drivers that we have on a substance abuse professional, no SAP program is the same. Sometimes they make they do the return to duty, and then they require, drug and alcohol testing every 2 weeks. Sometimes it's every other month. So you don't know. Sometimes they require them follow-up testing for a year. Sometimes it's 2 years. So you just have to let the process go with a substance abuse professional. The driver will need to select a substance abuse professional in the system in the clearinghouse. So that's why they need to be registered. And then the substance abuse professional will report back to the clearinghouse what needs to happen so that they're eligible for the return to duty and what type of follow-up testing is required. We'll go over that a little bit further as we move along. And then, of course, the state driving licensing agencies, they will be required to use the clearinghouse. They do have that 3-year cushion. So what type of violations do we need to report? So our employers, these are some of our commonly asked questions. Are employers of non-CDL drivers who operate commercial motor vehicles required to query or report violations to the clearinghouse? So this is an interesting fact. It is no non-CDL drivers are required to query or report violations to the clearinghouse. And right now it is only FMCSA. So if you have a driver that is FTA, Federal Transit, or FAA, most of the people on the call that manage fleets, you may have part of your drivers that are FTA, and then they also have a dual modality of FMCSA. You are only going to report FMCSA violations into the clearinghouse. So for example, if you have a driver that half-time drives FTA and half-time drives FMCSA, and you have a random and they get called for the random, you have to send them in under the modality that they at that time they were working under. Okay, so if it's FTA and they have a violation, you will not report it to the clearinghouse. Now, we do feel, this is a personal opinion, this is a vertical identity opinion, that that eventually the other modalities are going to hop on to the clearinghouse or do something similar because the information is so critical to the safety of our roads. The next common question is will a prospective employee's drug and alcohol violation history with other DOT modes be available in the clearinghouse? So as I just mentioned is no. So if they have a CDL and they have a violation with the FTA, you're not going to be able to see it. So yes, that's concerning. I understand. So again, we will continue to see how this rolls out and see how quickly the other modalities do jump on board. And then are CDL drivers required to register for the clearinghouse? So here's what I've been telling my owner operators. If you are not planning on going and applying anywhere else, you do not need to register for the clearinghouse. However, if you're a CDL driver and you are an employee, then you need to be registered to provide electronic consent in the clearinghouse to a prospective or a current employer, because they will be required, the motor carrier is required to do a full query of your driving record. And that's going to include all pre-employment queries starting on January 6th. And then a driver must also be registered to electronically view information on his or her own clearinghouse record. So you're not going to be able to view anything about you, or if anyone, reported a violation. So we have someone that comes to a clinic, they don't even know anything about the clearinghouse because many, drivers may not know. And they pull one of those where they're like, yep, we're going to walk out because we know it's going to be positive. Well, then the MRO is going to report that. And the driver is not going to know that they had a violation. They're not going to be able to view their record. They're not even going to be able to apply really with the motor carrier unless they give consent to access that record. Okay, what actions will users be required to take in the clearinghouse? So I have divided this up by section. So there's the driver must register as a user. Let me do my little highlighter pen here. So the driver will be required to register as a user and consent to full query requests. And only if they have a violation, will they have to select their substance abuse professional. That's only for drivers. Employers, you will not only have to register as a user, you can manage your assistants. So in other words, for the DERs that are on the call, if you have someone else that assists you, then you can go ahead and add them at that time. You will need to select your third-party administrator if you work with someone to do that. And then you will have to request full driver consent for full queries on your new hires. You will also have to do that on an annual basis. You will be required, just like you have to run MVR reports right now on an annual basis for your drivers, you will also be required to run clearinghouse. And you may be like, well, why? Well, because you don't know what happened outside of your time. Let's say that they were going to go apply somewhere else and they had a violation when they did that pre-employment drug test. So you will be required to run those annually as well. And then you will also be required to query the driver violation information and then report drug and alcohol program violations. We talked about that. And then a report on your return to duty and follow-up testing. So what does this section mean for a motor carrier? So let's say that you have a driver that had a violation. You decide that, they're awesome and you want to keep them and you want to give them grace and they're going to go see a substance abuse professional. The substance abuse professional comes back and says, yep, here's the plan that we're setting up for him or her, and then we're going to require that they do the return to duty test. Once they do the return to duty test, then you as the employer have to send them in for that return to duty test, which is always observed. And then once that return to duty test is completed, the motor carrier is required to go into the clearinghouse to state that has been completed and that it was clear. And then all the follow-up testing that's required that was reported into the SAP, you will do that. Again, if you are a client of ours, that's part of our program, and we will be happy to do that process for you. For third-party administrators such as us, we register just like you do. We manage our assistants. We request driver consent on full queries for our clients. And then we also query driver violation information. We report out on your behalf your drug and alcohol program violations and return to duty and follow-up testing. The MRO and SAP, that's kind of out of our control. When I say out of our control, that's more, the driver selects the SAP, and the MRO is a third party that a lot of the times that neither the motor carrier nor the third party administrator will get involved with, unless it's a refusal to test. Many times they'll call and say, hey, do you want this will be a non-reportable case, or do you want us to report it? So I'm wondering how that's going to happen as well. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Okay, let's talk about the drivers and what they need to do to register. So high level, for every single transportation specialist that's on the webinar today, all of you will have to complete a two-factor authentication and verification. It's right here. You will need to enter date of birth, CDL number, and state of record. Enter contact information, choose preferred contact method, and accept terms and conditions. These are for drivers, although all of us have to do the two-factor authentication verification. So the driver needs to register with the clearinghouse, and I'm going to give you the link on where to do that. They'll be able to view their information, provide specific consent to an employer that's going to be hiring them, and select a SAP when necessary. This is what the driver dashboard looks like. So when you initially log on as a driver, it'll immediately tell you whether you do have violations or you don't. So right here, you have no drug and alcohol violations. There's 0 violations here. And then when you do have a violation, here's Lisa, who has a violation. The violation occurred on 10/20/2025, and it was a random test, and it was reported by West Coast Trucking, and she had a positive on alcohol. So here, if Lisa logs on and there is no violations, then she can go ahead and say, okay, here is West Coast Trucking asking for a consent, a query, East Coast Trucking asking for a query, and Southern Trucking asking for a query. So at that point, she can either consent to any of these queries or do not consent. And then here on the right, if she logs in and she has a violation that has been reported, and it also shows that she has 3 pending requests, which are over here, but or these are both samples, but they're represented what it would look like here. And then at this point is the driver is responsible to select a substance abuse professional. So that's why the substance abuse professionals have to register, because you can't select a substance abuse professional if they're not in the clearinghouse. Okay. So then in the clearinghouse, the driver is going to be able to view their detailed violation information. So again, here's more information about the violation. And it was an alcohol violation. And then here are the test details. The employer, who was the employer when the violation occurred, the DOT number, the TPA that is managing their program, and then the type of, it was a random. And as you can see here, that the return to duty is incomplete. So the next step is if the SAP says, yes, they're eligible to return, they can do the return to duty test, then they would be able to go in and see that that has not been done, as well as the carrier, you'll be able to see that the return to duty has not been completed. So on the driver dashboard, you can view pending and completed query requests. So here is an updated query result. JB Hunt is a pre-employment, and it tells you right here that the eligibility status is prohibited. So they did a request on 12/5/2023, and the consent was requested by JB Hunt on 12/5. the consent was submitted on 12/6, and basically it's letting JB Hunt know that they are not eligible to drive. And here's West Coast asking for a request, and the driver can either approve or not approve. This is how the driver, what it looks like when they have to identify a substance abuse professional and view return to duty process status. So it gives them a timeline, right? You can see the timeline here of everything that needs to happen. And it tells the driver clearly that they are prohibited, sorry about that, from operating a commercial motor vehicle, that that the violation was reported on a specific date. And now where they're at is that they must select a substance abuse professional. So this is where you would select your SAP, enter their location, and then you would be able to search for a SAP that is in the system. And then now that your return to duty status has been entered, because the SAP has reported it, then here is the violation that was reported. The substance abuse professional was completed on 12/26. The return to duty initial assessment was completed on 1/15. Here is the training plan, and the return to duty test was completed 6/15. So now the only thing that's required is the follow-up testing. So this is the information that the motor carrier will be required to enter in for you. The motor carrier is required to enter this on your drivers. Okay, employers, a lot of the same, same two-factor authentication verification. You're going to enter your company information, your contact information, and again, accept the terms and conditions. And then employers with a U.S. DOT number will register for an account to the clearinghouse via the FMCSA portal. So employers need to complete the following actions in the clearinghouse. You have to register. You have to report the drug and alcohol violations in the clearinghouse. You have to request specific consent from the drivers that you wish to conduct a full query on. You need to designate your third-party administrator so that they can enter violation information or conduct queries on your behalf. And then you need to report a negative return to duty alcohol or controlled substance test result. And then report the completion of follow-up testing plan. Okay, so for employers, when are you not allowed to have a driver perform a safety-sensitive function? If a driver received a positive, adulterated, or substituted drug test result, that is a violation. You must report it. A driver has an alcohol confirmation test result with an alcohol concentration of 0.04 or greater, it must be reported. If a driver refused to submit to a test for drugs or alcohol, such as in a random or a pre-employment, it must be reported. Driver used alcohol prior to a post-accident alcohol test. So what that means is driver had an accident, they're not allowed to use alcohol immediately following that accident until they have a post-accident alcohol test. If they do that, then that's a violation. If the driver refused to provide a specimen for controlled substance testing, that's the same as, refusal to test. And any actual knowledge violations as defined in 382.107, which are driver has used alcohol or controlled substances based on direct observation of the employee, of the employer's direct observation of the employee. In other words, you find meth in the bathroom and they're the only ones that were there, and you've taken your class, your reasonable suspicion class, and they're high. You see them drinking alcohol, or someone tells you that they were drinking alcohol, an assistant went with them and they're like, yes, they're drinking while they're driving. Well, that is a employer's direct observation or information that's been provided by a previous employer. So for example, what's going to happen is, or it may happen is, you're hiring someone and, they were your buddies with the other motor carrier that's down the street, and they're like, oh yeah, I tried to hire him, but he didn't pass. He had a violation. He did a refusal to test, and it was never reported, right? Because the clearinghouse didn't exist and he never worked for him. But he has information. Well, then the new motor carrier must report that now because it's after January 6th. If they have a traffic citation for a DUI, then you must report it. And then if an employee's own admission of alcohol or controlled substance use, which means they voluntarily check themselves into a Hanley Hazleton. It's an alcohol rehab place. I believe they're out of Florida. So if they check themselves in, then they're voluntarily admitting that they have a problem. And so they need to, the violation needs to be recorded, and they need to be under the substance abuse professional plan. All right, we are making good progress. So queries and consent requests. Employers will be required to query the clearinghouse for 1, pre-employment screening to ensure that the prospective employee is eligible to perform safety-sensitive functions. You will do that at the same time that you're running your background check, your motor vehicle record, driving record, and also your pre-employment drug screening. So that'll be a part of your pre-employment screening that you will need to do. And then you will also need to do annual verification to ensure that the driver is still eligible to perform safety-sensitive functions. As far as the consents, it talks about it here that there is specific consent required for each full query, and then there's just a general consent that's required for your annual verification. So again, we go back to the queries and consent. If the driver is not registered and you, the motor carrier, are hiring a CDL driver and you are trying to onboard them, then they cannot provide consent to you because they are not registered. So you will need to put into your pre-employment process, possibly even sit them down and have them register while they're doing their application if they are not already registered in the clearinghouse, because they must register in the clearinghouse to provide consent for full pre-employment full queries. And then employers must obtain a driver's consent before the query before querying the driver's violation information. And then drivers who decline their consent cannot perform any safety sensitive functions, including operating a commercial motor vehicle for that employer. So I'm going to go over this very quickly because this is more about the third-party administrators. Again, the third-party administrators such as us, we can enter drug and alcohol violation information into the clearinghouse on behalf of the motor carrier, or you, if you are our motor carrier under our administration. We can also request consent from the driver on behalf of the employer. We can query the clearinghouse on behalf of the employer, and we can designate a assistant to help us with that. We have a team of background screening professionals that at the time that they do the criminal background check and run the motor vehicle records, they will be doing the querying for any drug and alcohol violations. So this is one of our last few slides. So if you do have questions, go ahead and start asking them on the left-hand side. So right now, the action items are to register your company and yourself if you're an owner-operator. The fleets, then you need to register your company and add your assistants. You need to designate your consortium third-party administrators if you have one. You need to go ahead and set up your assistants, and then have a plan. Please have a plan to encourage your drivers to register. We will be having some follow-up webinars and recording of the webinars to help drivers learn how to register in the portal. And if you are a motor carrier that wants help, then please reach out to me. And you can contact me at sarah@verticalidentity.com or consortium@verticalidentity.com, and we'll set up a time to share screens and do this, walk you through the process one-on-one. So here is some more information that you can learn about the clearinghouse. You can go ahead and visit the link right here. It's https://clearinghouse.fmcsa.dot.gov. There you can go ahead and subscribe for email updates, read your frequently asked questions, and download the clearinghouse fact sheets. And then the fact sheets are really great because they are by by user. So there is one, what the motor carriers must do, what the driver must do, what a TPA must do, what an MRO must do. So it goes back and explains to you by user the fact sheet and what your responsibilities are. In order to register for the clearinghouse, so you can go ahead and copy this link. We are making a copy of the webinars being recorded. So if you want a copy of the webinar, please email me and I will be happy to shoot you a link. We'll also be publishing it to our YouTube channel so you can review it there with your staff and your team. That is the end of the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and leave this slide up and see if there's any questions. Okay, we have a question from Michael. So we no longer do interstate travel and our US DOT number has been revoked. Do I still need to watch this webinar? Okay, if you are not governed by the DOT, then the clearinghouse does not apply to you. So can we get a copy of the presentation? Yes, you can. This was asked by Oscar. Oscar, you can go ahead and email us and we'll also be publishing it on our YouTube channel for you to be able to go over it with your team. Is this going to be available as a slideshow after we are done? Yes, we will be publishing the webinar on our YouTube page, and you can also ask for a copy of the webinar. So we don't have CDL drivers or vehicles over 26,000 pounds, says Michael. Thank you for your invitation and time. So he got off the call. Again, this does not apply to non-CDL drivers at all. And it only applies to FMCSA CDL drivers at this time. Is it a requirement, Oscar asks, is it a requirement that all trucking companies register for the clearinghouse, or is there a size requirement or any one truck also? The answer is yes. There is, if you are an owner operator and you only have one truck, yes, you must register. Let's see. Hold on, there's a lot of questions here, so my screen just moved. Give me 1 minute. Let's see. Okay, so as far as Oscar, yes, even if you have one truck, you are required. And then I have a question regarding... We are a small trucking company, Kyle asks. We are a small trucking company who runs under our own authority. Currently, we only have one truck that is driven by me. Yes. Kyle, you must register as a motor carrier as well as a driver. Where do you enter, Yesela asks, where do you enter the query on the portal and what information is requested? So, Yesela, I'm assuming that you are asking from a motor carrier perspective and requesting the query on the portal for a motor carrier. Once you register as a motor carrier, there will be a section in the portal where you will be able to request the query, and the information that you are going to need is going to be their CDL number and first and last name. That reminds me that I didn't go over in the webinar that as of January, all CCFs are changing for the labs because the way that the violations have to be reported into the clearinghouse, it is going to be by CDL number and CDL state. So you will need to make sure to have that information in your driver qualification file and in your HR files of what their CDL number is and the CDL state that they belong to, because that will be the new go-to number. So it will no longer be like Social Security number or some other number. And the reference for that DOT, a chain of custody, when they do the drug test, it must be CDL number and state. So Jenna asked if this is just for CDL drivers or anyone operating a company vehicle. It is only for CDL drivers. Diana asked, I'm a motor carrier. The authorities are under my name and my husband is a driver. Am I required to register my husband, or what? And what will be considered an owner operator? Okay, Diana. So I believe in your case, if you are the designated employer representative, so you are managing the motor carrier for your husband and he drives, then you need to go ahead and register your husband's motor carrier with his DOT number, and then your husband has to register as a driver. And you, Diana, have to go pull a query on your husband, because it's you need to have that for your driver qualification file and for your audit. So yes, you will still need to do that. Our YouTube channel is Vertical Identity. If you go to YouTube, it's under Vertical Identity. It's not up there yet. So if you just Google Vertical Identity, and you will see a link. I'll be able to pull it up here in a minute. Let's see. Let me find it. Here it is, Vertical Identity, Background Screening, and Drug Testing. I'll leave that up for your reference. I will post the webinar to my YouTube channel, Robert. I might be able to get it done this afternoon. It will probably be tomorrow. Then we have a really, really interesting question from Oscar. Oscar, you've asked great questions. So are Mexican drivers with the commercial international driver's license or DMV pull notice also required to register? So yes, they are required to register. All Mexican and Canadian employees and service agents currently required to comply with DOT and FMCSA drug and alcohol testing requirements must comply with the Clearinghouse final rule. So the answer is yes. This is really going to rock, our world. There's a lot of changes, or it's very positive, but there's some additional work that's going to be required. And as an employer, a question from Sandy. As an employer, do I need to register all my CDL drivers or just the ones who have a positive test? So Sandy, my answer to you is you don't have to register your drivers if those drivers, first of all, Sandy, you shouldn't be registering your drivers. The drivers need to register their drivers themselves, because you cannot register for them. They must register for themselves, because if they are going to go work for someone else, then they need to have their login and password, and their information is private unless they consent to giving out that information. So what we have been doing is, and again, I'm going to do a, webinar, and I'm going to have, go through a simulated how to enroll as a driver. So that way, and I'll post it also to our FMCSA or Vertical Identity YouTube page, so that you can refer back to that with your drivers. So you'll be able to pull that up, have a computer screen up, and say, hey, just follow this step by step. We still have about 41 of you on the call. I do not see any other questions, but now is the time. We have about 5 minutes left. Oscar is asking, will the violations be reported to the DMV, or will they cross-reference back and forth? So That's a great question, Oscar. So there are some states that already have their own process. Like Texas is one of them. They already have their own process of reporting violations. Okay, so when you're a third-party administrator of motor care and you're in Texas, you're required to report it to Texas, and Texas collects that information and reports, and matches it against your CDL. However, that is currently, for example, in the state of Arizona, that's not happening, right? Because there's no way to report violations. But now those violations are all reported into the clearinghouse, and then it depends on when this individual state is linked into the clearinghouse. So it'll, like I had mentioned before earlier in the webinar, is the states have 3 years to do this. So I think that there's going to be a little bit of a gap in communication and how they cross-reference, and no one really knows the answer to that right now. So we just have to, if you stay registered on the clearinghouse for the updates, which is what I'm doing, and just stay on top of the news articles. And I have a LinkedIn. I publish things all the time on my LinkedIn profile. I can show you where that is. You can find me under Sarah Hope. And Vertical Identity, I publish information about the changes on my LinkedIn as well if you want to stay in touch that way. And of course, the easiest way to do this is just become our client. We're extremely affordable. We will help you be compliant from beginning to end, and we will, walk you through the process. So if you're interested in having a one-on-one with me, please reach out. Happy to get on the phone, see how much you're paying, see where we can save you time and money, and how we can help you better administer your compliance program. I do have a question from Aubrey. Okay, I have a question from Diana. Sorry about that. And then just to confirm, the deadline for registration is January 6, 2020. So you can register anytime up to January 6. You have to start doing queries on January 6. So if you're hiring anyone, you're required to do the queries starting January 6. Registration is very easy, Diana. If you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to walk you through it. We can share screens and do that. And however, I wouldn't wait until then, because you have action items that start on January 6th. And then Aubrey is asking, do I need to request a report for existing drivers or only new drivers after January 6, 2020? Aubrey, you will need to request annual verification for your current drivers. You will need to figure out when you're going to run those on an annual basis, just like you do your driving records now. So I would just do those at the same time, just for ease of use for you. So whenever it is that you're running your driving records for your other ones, just run a clearinghouse query at that time. So you will have to do it annually for your current drivers, and then you will need to, starting January 6th, do it for new drivers as well. If I missed anyone's question, please send me a message under broadcast message so that I can answer it. I believe that I have answered the questions. And Diana, you're very welcome for the response. I'm glad this is very helpful to all of you. It's very exciting for us as we see all sorts of things and all sorts of interesting dynamics that are always being reported and lots of loopholes. It is 12:59. I do not see any other questions coming up. I appreciate everybody that was on the call today. If you have any questions, you can email me directly at Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, at verticalidentity.com. or consortium@verticalidentity.com if you're interested in having a one-on-one with us to go over your program. I'm happy to do that, be honored to do that, and review how we can save you time and money and handhold you through the process. Again, thank you so much for being on the call. Have a great day.